You know that person who makes your blood boil just by existing? The one whose voice alone triggers something primal in you? Carl Gustav Jung discovered why you hate certain people with such intensity. And the answer is more twisted than you think. It's not about them at all. Jung spent years documenting what he called the most disturbing discovery in psychology. He watched thousands of patients create enemies out of thin air. He saw marriages destroyed by phantom accusations. He witnessed entire nations project their darkness onto other races, creating the psychological foundation for genocide. Then he went mad, trying to face his own projections. Between 1913 and 1917, Jung descended into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He was, in his own words, menaced by a psychosis. He'd walk through his garden having full conversations with invisible figures. He'd write dialogue with entities that seemed more real than the people in his life. What he discovered in that madness changed everything. See, Jung realized that the people who trigger you most violently aren't random. They're mirrors, but not mirrors of who you are, mirrors of who you refuse to be. Every time someone makes you irrationally angry, they're showing you a piece of yourself you've buried so deep you'd rather die than admit it exists. Jung called it the shadow, the parts of you that you've spent your entire life rejecting, the qualities you've decided are so unacceptable that you've banished them from consciousness. But here's where it gets dark. Those rejected parts don't disappear. They live in your unconscious, gathering power, waiting. And when you meet someone who even slightly resembles what you've disowned, your psyche goes to war. Not with them, with yourself. The intensity of your hatred, that's the exact measure of how hard you're working to keep that quality unconscious. The more you despise something in another person, the more of it lives in your shadow. Jung learned this the hard way. After his break with Freud, who he initially worshipped as a father figure, Jung realized he'd been projecting his need for approval onto him. When that projection shattered, it turned into pure hatred. Both men spent the rest of their lives unable to mention each other without rage, because they were fighting themselves. This isn't some mystical concept. Jung proved it clinically. Through word association tests at Burghölzli Hospital, he could identify what people were projecting by their physiological responses. Delayed reactions, emotional disturbance, memory failures, all markers of hitting a shadow projection. One nurse he tested showed extreme reactions to words about theft. She projected suspicion onto everyone around her. That same evening, she confessed to stealing. We create our enemies from our own rejected darkness. And until you understand this mechanism, you're its prisoner. Jung discovered something that most people can't handle. You don't actually know why you hate anyone. Your conscious mind invents reasons. They're arrogant, they're lazy, they're selfish, they're fake. But these are just stories your psyche tells to avoid the real truth. You hate them because they're you. Not the you that you present to the world. The you that you've buried alive. Here's how the mechanism works. From birth, you start dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Your parents praise certain behaviors and punish others. Society rewards specific traits and shames their opposites. You learn quickly which parts of you get love and which parts get rejected. So you make a deal with yourself. You take everything unacceptable, your selfishness, your rage, your weakness, your cruelty, your sexual desires, your laziness, whatever threatens your self-image, and you stuff it into what Jung called the shadow. But psychological content doesn't just disappear because you reject it. Jung observed this in patient after patient. The repressed material forms what he called feeling-toned complexes, autonomous clusters of psychic energy that operate independently of your conscious will. They're like psychological tumors growing in the dark of your unconscious. And they need somewhere to go. Enter projection. Your psyche finds a brilliant solution to an impossible problem. If you can't tolerate these qualities in yourself, you'll see them in others instead. The unconscious literally throws your disowned content onto other people, like a film projector throws images onto a screen. The other person becomes a walking representation of everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself. Jung documented this process with scientific precision. At Burghölzli Hospital, he used word association tests on hundreds of patients. When someone hit a complex, a shadow projection, their entire body would react. Heart rate spiked, breathing changed, response times doubled or tripled. One small man, nicknamed Short by his tall brothers, developed a complex so severe he walked on his tiptoes to appear taller. But here's what Jung noticed. This man saw everyone else as obsessed with height. He projected his own complex onto the entire world. Every conversation, every glance, every interaction was about height, but only in his mind. The projection was so complete he couldn't see it was coming from inside him. Jung saw this pattern everywhere. A woman terrified of being abandoned would become possessive and controlling, driving partners away. A man who couldn't admit his own dishonesty would see lies and manipulation in everyone around him. A patient who denied their cruelty would experience the world as viciously attacking them. In her fear of being abused, Jung wrote about one patient. She became the abuser. The projection mechanism operates with ruthless logic. Whatever you can't face in yourself, you'll be forced to face in others. And the confrontation won't be calm or rational. It'll feel like survival. Because it is survival, the survival of your ego's carefully constructed identity. Jung learned that the intensity of your emotional reaction is diagnostic. Mild irritation, probably just a personality clash. But that white-hot rage that seems to come from nowhere, that's your shadow screaming to stay unconscious. The more violently you react, the more of yourself you're seeing in the other person. And here's the truly disturbing part. You're usually projecting onto people who barely possess the quality you hate. Your psyche just needs the smallest hook. A gesture, a word, a look to hang an entire shadow projection on someone. Jung called these people hooks for a reason. They don't have to actually be what you see in them. They just have to be close enough for your unconscious to make them carry your disowned darkness. Which means the person you hate might be relatively innocent of what you're accusing them of. But you're guilty as hell. Jung didn't discover the shadow through academic study. He discovered it by losing his mind. After his break with Freud in 1913, Jung fell into what he called a state of inner uncertainty. But that's a polite way of describing what actually happened. The man who would become the world's authority on the unconscious was being eaten alive by his own. He wrote in his private journals, "I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible." He was 38 years old, had a wife, 5 children, a successful practice, and he was coming apart. So Jung did something that would destroy most people. He decided to let it happen. Every day he would descend into what he called active imagination. He'd sit alone in his study or walk through his garden, and he'd let the figures from his unconscious speak, not metaphorically. They literally spoke to him, full conversations with autonomous entities that seemed more real than the physical world. He met Philemon, an old man with bull horns and kingfisher wings. Philemon taught Jung about the objective reality of the psyche. These weren't hallucinations, Philemon insisted. They were aspects of Jung himself that had been split off, living independently in the unconscious. Then came Ka, who Jung described as Philemon's shadow. Where Philemon was wise, Ka was earthly, dark, primitive. Ka represented everything Jung's intellectual, rational mind rejected. But the most disturbing encounter was with Salome. She appeared blind, accompanied by a black serpent. Jung wrote, "I do not love her, I fear her, my knees tremble." Salome represented the dangerous feminine, the erotic, the irrational, everything that terrified Jung about losing control. These weren't dreams. Jung was wide awake, walking through his garden in Switzerland, having full conversations with aspects of his own psyche that had taken on independent life. His family thought he was going insane. His colleagues whispered about his mental state, and Jung himself admitted, "I was menaced by a psychosis." But he kept going. He filled journal after journal, the black books with these dialogues, and slowly a pattern emerged. Every figure he met was a piece of himself he'd rejected. Philemon was the spiritual wisdom he'd dismissed as unscientific. Ka was the primitive darkness he'd tried to civilize away. Salome was the chaotic feminine he'd tried to control with masculine logic. His shadow wasn't just one thing. It was an entire population of disowned selves. The most brutal revelation came when Jung confronted what he called his murder. In his visions, he saw himself killing a blonde hero figure named Siegfried. This wasn't symbolic. In the vision, Jung shot him and felt genuine horror at what he'd done. Later he understood. Siegfried represented his heroic ideal, his ego's inflated self-image. To face his shadow, Jung had to murder his identification with being the hero. He had to accept being the villain in his own story. Here's what Jung actually wrote to himself during this period. "You preach hypocritical composure, But when it really matters, are you calm? No, you are not. Pathetic liar. You consume yourself in inner rage. Your tongue speaks cold daggers. Your eyes flash with hatred. This from the man who presented himself as the composed Swiss doctor. Jung discovered his chronic impatience with patients, his desperate need for recognition, his sexual desires for his patients, including Sabina Spielrein, with whom he had what he admitted was an erotic relationship that nearly destroyed both their careers. He found his cruelty, his vanity, his cowardice, his wish to dominate others intellectually, his fear of being seen as ordinary. "I will crush your glorious superiority under my feet," he wrote to his own shadow, "and stamp it into the dirt." The descent lasted 4 years. Jung later said these were the most important years of his life. Everything he would teach about psychology came from this period of controlled madness. But here's what most people don't understand about Jung's discovery. He didn't overcome his shadow. He didn't defeat it or transcend it. He made friends with it. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Jung learned. Try to kill it, it grows stronger. Try to ignore it, it projects onto everyone around you. But approach it with curiosity, even respect. It transforms from enemy to teacher. Jung emerged from his descent with a new understanding. Everyone is walking around possessed by the parts of themselves they refuse to see. And until you turn and face what you've rejected, you'll keep meeting it in others. Over and over. Forever. Jung watched Nazi Germany rise and knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't seeing politics. He was seeing shadow projection on a national scale. As early as 1918, years before Hitler appeared, Jung noticed something disturbing in his German patients' dreams. They were full of blonde beasts, Vikings, berserkers, symbols of primitive violence that had been buried for centuries. The German collective unconscious was preparing to vomit up its shadow. Hitler was the most prodigious personification of all human inferiorities, Jung wrote after the war. Not Germany's greatest leader, their collective shadow made flesh. Think about what Germany represented before the Nazis. Order, discipline, culture, philosophy, everything rational, controlled, civilized. They'd spent centuries building an identity as Europe's most sophisticated culture. But what happens to all the qualities that don't fit that image? The barbarism, the chaos, the bloodthirst, the primitive emotions, they don't disappear. They go into the collective shadow, gathering power, waiting for their moment. Hitler didn't create the darkness, he just gave it permission to live. Jung saw this mechanism clearly. In Hitler, every German should have seen his own shadow, his own worst danger. Instead, they projected it onto the Jews, the communists, the gypsies, anyone who could carry what they couldn't face in themselves. The Jews became the screen for every rejected German quality. Greedy, that's the Jews. Weak, the Jews. Corrupting, the Jews. Inferior, the Jews. It didn't matter that these projections contradicted each other. How could Jews be both weak and dangerously powerful, both inferior and secretly controlling everything? Logic doesn't apply to shadow projection. The unconscious doesn't care about consistency. It only cares about finding somewhere to put what it can't tolerate. Jung called this epidemic insanity, not individual madness, collective possession by the shadow. And here's what's truly terrifying. Every group does this. Jung documented the pattern everywhere. White Americans projecting their primitive shadow onto black populations. Capitalists projecting greed onto communists while denying their own. Christians projecting their darkness onto pagans. Every group creating an enemy to carry what they can't admit about themselves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate, Jung warned. You want to know why wars happen? This is why wars happen. Groups can't face their collective shadow, so they project it onto other nations. The enemy becomes absolutely evil, inhuman, deserving of destruction, not because of what they've done, but because of what they carry for us psychologically. Jung watched this happening in real time during World War II. Each side projected pure evil onto the other. The Allies couldn't see their own shadow in what they were fighting. The atom bomb, the firebombing of Dresden, that wasn't Allied darkness. That was justified response to enemy evil. Both sides were fighting their own shadows, using the other as a screen. Jung saw the same pattern in witch hunts. What qualities did medieval society need to reject? Female power, sexuality, paganism, earth wisdom, everything that threatened Christian patriarchal order. So they projected it onto witches, created an enemy that carried their collective shadow, then burned it alive, thinking they were destroying evil. They were trying to burn parts of themselves. The Salem witch trials, mass shadow projection. McCarthy's communist hunts, shadow projection. Every genocide in history, groups trying to exterminate their own darkness by destroying those who carry it for them. Jung's most chilling observation: the people who become screens for collective projections are usually innocent of what they're accused of. The Jews weren't actually controlling Germany's banks and corrupting its culture. The witches weren't actually consorting with Satan. But once a group has projected its shadow, facts don't matter. Reality doesn't matter. The projection becomes more real than truth. Modern politics, it's a shadow projection festival. Each side sees pure evil in the other. Not disagreement, not different values, pure evil. The left projects its shadow onto the right. Ignorance, cruelty, fascism. The right projects its shadow onto the left. Chaos, weakness, degeneracy. Neither side can see that they're fighting aspects of themselves. Social media amplifies this exponentially. Algorithms literally profit from shadow projection. The more triggered you are, the more you engage. The more you project, the more content you consume. We've built machines that feed on our shadows. Jung saw where this leads. He lived through it. When collective shadow projection reaches critical mass, when entire populations project their darkness onto the same target, you get Holocaust, genocide, world war. We have simply forgotten what a human being really is, Jung wrote. We have to discover our shadow, otherwise we are driven into a world war in order to see what beasts we are. The solution? Individual responsibility. If he only learns to deal with his own shadow, Jung believed, then he has done something real for the world. Stop projecting your darkness onto your political enemies. Stop seeing pure evil in other groups. Start looking at what you hate in them and asking, where does this live in me? Because until we face our collective shadows, we'll keep creating enemies to destroy. And eventually we'll succeed. You think you know when you're being rational. You think you can tell the difference between valid criticism and emotional reaction. Jung discovered you're almost certainly wrong. After 20 years of clinical practice, Jung identified the exact signals that reveal when you're projecting. Not maybe projecting, definitely projecting. Your body tells the truth even when your mind invents elaborate justifications. First signal, the emotional charge. When someone triggers genuine, proportionate anger, it feels clean. You're angry about something specific they did. The emotion matches the offense. You can explain it without your voice shaking. But projection? That's different. Projection feels like touching a live wire. Your entire body reacts. Heart racing, face flushing, hands trembling. The anger feels ancient, primal, like it's been waiting your whole life to explode. Jung documented this physiologically. Word association tests showed projection creates measurable chaos in your nervous system. Response times triple. Breathing becomes erratic. Patients would literally forget the trigger word because the complex hit so hard. One executive came to Jung, convinced his business partner was sabotaging him. When Jung tested him, words related to betrayal and trust created massive physiological disturbance. But here's what emerged. The executive had been skimming funds. He was projecting his own betrayal onto his innocent partner. The body doesn't lie about projection. Your conscious mind does. Second signal, the repetition pattern. You keep meeting the same enemy wearing different faces. Every boss is a tyrant. Every partner becomes controlling. Every friend eventually betrays you. Jung saw this constantly. One woman had been betrayed by 14 friends in a row. 14 different women, different personalities, different circumstances, but somehow they all became the same enemy. That's not bad luck. That's projection. When you're projecting a shadow quality, you'll find it everywhere. Because you're not seeing what's there, you're seeing what you carry. The same drama plays out with different actors, because you're the one writing the script. Third signal, the absolute quality. Real people are complex. They have good qualities and bad ones. They're kind sometimes, cruel others. They're neither saints nor demons. But projection doesn't do nuance. When you're projecting, The other person becomes absolutely something, completely narcissistic, totally incompetent, pure evil. There's no gray area, no complexity, no humanity. Jung noticed patients would use absolute language when projecting. He never listens. She always manipulates. They're completely selfish. The absoluteness is the tell. Real perception sees complexity. Projection sees archetypes. Fourth signal, the inability to see your role. This one's the killer. When you're projecting, you literally cannot see how you contribute to the dynamic. It's all them. You're just an innocent victim of their behavior. Jung watched marriages destroyed by this blindness. A husband would rage about his wife's coldness while being emotionally brutal himself. A wife would complain about neglect while withdrawing all affection. Neither could see their part. We are all too prone to transfer to our fellows the injustice and violence we inflict upon our own natures, Jung observed. The projection mechanism includes a scotoma, a blind spot about your own behavior. You can see their cruelty in microscopic detail but not your own. You catalog their failures but forget yours. Fifth signal, the trigger specificity. Projection isn't random. Specific types of people trigger you. Confident women, weak men, authority figures, spiritual types, intellectuals, artists, whatever represents your rejected shadow. Jung mapped these patterns precisely. If you rejected your own intelligence to fit in, you'll hate pretentious intellectuals. If you buried your sexuality for religious reasons, you'll be triggered by sluts and perverts. If you disowned your aggression, you'll despise angry people. The trigger type reveals the shadow content, like a photo negative of your psyche. Here's how to test yourself. Jung's method simplified. Write down the 3 people who trigger you most. Not annoy trigger, the ones who make you genuinely angry just by existing. List exactly what you hate about each one. Be specific, not their jerks. What exactly makes them jerks? Now the hard part, look at those qualities. Where do they live in you? Not identically, but in essence. Their arrogance might be your hidden insecurity. Their weakness might be your rejected vulnerability. Their manipulation might be your unconscious control. If you can't find it in yourself, you're not looking hard enough. Jung tested this on himself constantly. When he felt triggered by a patient's arrogance, he'd examine his own superiority complex. When irritated by weakness, he'd look for his own cowardice. He always found it. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Not sometimes, everything. The moment you think you're not projecting, that's when you're projecting most dangerously. Because projection includes the inability to see projection. It's a perfect self-concealing mechanism. Your shadow is smarter than you are. Most people discover their shadow and immediately try to kill it. Jung learned this is exactly wrong. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood, he discovered. Fight your shadow, it fights back. Deny it, it projects harder. Try to transcend it, it pulls you into hell. Jung found only one thing works: integration, not conquering, not fixing, not healing. Integration. Here's what that actually means. You have to treat your shadow like a real person, because psychologically it is. It has its own thoughts, its own agenda, its own power. It's been living in your unconscious for decades, getting stronger every time you reject it. Jung developed a technique called active imagination, not meditation, not visualization, a deliberate dialogue with the rejected parts of yourself. You sit alone, you quiet your conscious mind, and you let the shadow speak. This isn't metaphorical. Jung's patients would have actual conversations with their shadows. The shadow would say things the conscious mind didn't know, reveal memories that had been buried, express opinions that horrified the ego. One of Jung's patients, a reserved professor, met his shadow as a primitive savage. The shadow told him, "You've killed me with your civilization, your books, your theories. I am everything you murdered to become respectable." The professor was repulsed, but Jung insisted he keep talking to this figure, ask it what it wanted, listen without judgment. The shadow wanted to dance, to fight, to scream. Everything the professor had buried under academic propriety. So Jung gave him homework. Integrate one shadow desire per week. Nothing dramatic. Dance alone in his study. Express anger when he felt it. Stop censoring his sexuality with his wife. The professor thought this would destroy his life. Instead, his depression lifted, his creativity exploded, his marriage transformed. He wasn't becoming primitive, he was becoming whole. But here's what Jung never sugarcoated: shadow work is brutal. In this time of descent, 7 years more or less, genuine courage and strength are required, Jung warned. You're not just facing rejected aspects of yourself, you're dismantling your entire identity structure. The ego doesn't die quietly. Jung watched patients have complete breakdowns during shadow work. Executives realizing they were exactly the kind of person they despised, wives discovering they'd become their abusive mothers, men finding the weakness they'd spent lifetimes denying. One patient, a woman who prided herself on independence, discovered her shadow was desperately needy. She'd built her entire identity on not needing anyone. But the shadow revealed the truth. She was dying of loneliness, had pushed everyone away to avoid feeling dependent. Facing this nearly destroyed her. She spent months in what Jung called the dark night of the soul. Everything she thought she was turned out to be a defense against what she actually was. But then something shifted. She stopped fighting the neediness, started admitting when she needed help, allowed herself to be vulnerable. The shadow transformed from enemy to teacher. This is the paradox Jung discovered. When you integrate your shadow, you don't become worse, you become real. Dream work reveals the shadow differently. Jung saw dreams as the via regia to the unconscious. Your shadow appears as same-sex figures in dreams. The people you're fighting, running from, or trying to kill, that's you. Jung analyzed thousands of dreams. The pattern never changed. The threatening figure in your dreams is always a rejected aspect of yourself. The more terrifying they are, the more deeply you've buried that quality. A minister dreamed of being chased by a violent criminal. Jung helped him see the criminal represented his own repressed violence. He'd become a minister to escape his rage. But the rage hadn't disappeared. It lived in his shadow, growing stronger. The solution wasn't to become violent. It was to acknowledge the violence as part of him, to find healthy ways to express that aggressive energy, to stop pretending he was only light. The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected, Jung learned. You can't do shadow work intellectually. You have to feel it in your bones. Let it reorganize you from the inside. Here's the truth most therapists won't tell you. Shadow integration is a lifetime practice. Jung did it until he died at 85, still discovering new shadows, still finding projections. Because here's what happens when you integrate one shadow. You find another one behind it, and another behind that, layer after layer of rejected selves. But each integration makes you more complete, less triggered, more capable of seeing others as they actually are, not as screens for your projections. You stop creating enemies, stop destroying relationships, stop fighting yourself in every interaction. You still have a shadow. You'll always have a shadow, but now it's conscious. Now it's yours. And that changes everything. So now you know Jung's twisted truth. The people you hate are you. The qualities that trigger you are your own disowned darkness. Every enemy you create is a piece of yourself you refuse to face. Jung learned this through madness. Germany learned it through genocide. You're learning it right now. And once you see projection, you can't unsee it. But here's what's even more disturbing. Projection is just one way people reveal themselves. There are two other behaviors that expose someone's true character instantly. Behaviors that bypass all conscious performance and show you exactly who someone is at their core. These aren't projections. They're direct windows into someone's neurological wiring. They're attachment patterns formed in childhood. Two simple observations that reveal more about someone than years of knowing them ever could. Once you see these patterns, you'll understand why certain people always disappoint you, why others can't maintain relationships, and why some seem trustworthy but aren't. Watch it now.